Well, we're talking about this new report, the third in the series of the sixth assessment by the IPCC. Really, this is the most important one because, as you say, it's called mitigation. So I was quite pleased with the media on this one because several of them had a headline, which I think is highly appropriate, the now or never headline.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. Today, it's now or never, IPCC Mitigation Report. So we're going to be talking about the mitigation strategies that we can take to keep us within the 1.5 limit, according to the Paris Climate Accord. Apparently, we can do this. This is what they are saying. Maybe we can get a few ideas of what's going to happen if we don't start mitigation right away. Now, there are those who say that mitigation that was often held up in the foreground, previous reports, it's now kind of a day late and a dollar short. And some naysayers, or people who are realistic, however you want to call it, are saying it's time to start thinking about adaptation. And I think it's really interesting. One of the points that I've heard is, there's just a limited amount of money that the world has, a limited amount of brain power, a limited amount of focus. I mean, this is just simply true. And if mitigation is no longer in the offing, or if it's a long shot, it does make sense to perhaps refocus on adaptation. We have to think about where our time, money, and energy will be best spent. And I really am interested to hear what Peter and Paul have to say on this subject. Some people think that, hey, listen, if we focus more on adaptation, it's giving up. But is it really giving up, or is it just facing facts? Some people have said, and I know that I'm being general, and I'm being general on purpose. I've heard it bandied about that 1.5 is just simply not possible at this point. So the disasters that we've heard about that will accompany a 1.5 degree rise in temperature are already baked in the cake. And I'll freely admit that I am not a climate scientist, so I'm going to defer to Peter and Paul. But I have read enough that I'm beginning to wonder myself if 1.5 is possible, especially now with Biden. Because of this war that we have going on, the war in Ukraine, mounted by Russia, Biden is opening up the strategic petroleum reserve to the tune of 1 million barrels a day, every single day. And this is for the next 180 days. But, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets extended. Not only that, there have been increased exports of natural gas. And because of this, it seems as though the 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that at least the United States was aiming for by 2030 is all but impossible. So what I'm wondering is, if that is the case, Peter, what does that mean for the 1.5 degrees? Will we reach that? And in terms of mitigation, are we just taking on a fool's errand? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, Peter.
Well, we're talking about this new report, the third in the series of the sixth assessment by the IPCC. Really, this is the most important one because, as you say, it's called mitigation. And we need to think a little bit about what that word means. First of all, I always like to pick up on the media, see whether the media's got the messages right. So I was quite pleased with the media on this one because several of them had a headline, which I think is highly appropriate, the now or never headline. I guess they picked that up because the press release from the IPCC said that action and mitigation has to be, quote, immediate. So I hear what you're saying, Regina, And problem is we're not even trying yet. That's the problem. And, you know, we always seem to have things that are more important than, you know, saving the climate. And of course, now we've got this absolutely horrible situation going on in Ukraine. So it's hardly surprising that people are highly, highly disturbed about that, because let's face it, it's a threat to world peace, actually. Which leads me on to another point about mitigation, which is we have to decarbonize, right? We have to get rid of all of our fossil fuels, and we have to replace them all by all the wonderful, amazing, clean, renewable energy that we have. So that's rule one. We've known that for many, many, many years. No fossil fuels. Now it means no burning of wood in old coal plants. So zero carbon combustion is what I'm calling it, and replacing everything with this amazing technology that we've got. But we're not even trying. We're not even trying, let's face it. And our governments are obstructing, even trying to do something, as are fossil fuel corporations, obviously. I say obviously, but it really is amazing that they're still obstructing, right? I mean, they should be in the lead by now. You know, they should be energy corporations. And we've also got, of course, the big investment banking corporations. They're not helping. They're still obstructing because they're still financing more fossil fuels. I'm very familiar with this sort of discussion about mitigation and adaptation. But, you know, years and years and years ago, the scientists had a rule. And the rule was there is no adaptation without mitigation. So mitigation simply means that reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And the target, of course, has to be virtually zero greenhouse gas emissions. And this sixth assessment has been particularly good on that, made it very clear. What's missing from the report is how we put emissions into decline. How do we mitigate? We've known it for decades. It's totally obvious, but it's barely in this Working Group 3 report, which is pretty damn disappointing. So what I'm talking about is simply that the governments have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. They have to stop giving our money to the fossil fuel industry. So the fossil fuel industry continues what's been going on for, you know, forever, feels like forever, that's for sure. And they stop all their subsidies. Now that has to be immediate. The mitigation, the decline in emissions, this report is very clear. It has to be immediate. They have the word in the report many times. We really, you know, there's no need to delay anymore. I think we sort of fall prey, you know, to this idea that, well, it's a huge thing to do, you know, and how can we get off fossil fuels? It's actually ridiculously easy. It's just correcting the economics, that's all. And again, you know, I think of our great late friend, you know, Stuart Scott, who is always reminding us it's the economics which is fault and what we've got to correct.
I mean, you're right. It does seem so easy. We understand that. You know, I read, and we all know that with the lockdowns in the very beginning of COVID-19, that the emissions went down markedly, quickly. And then, of course, once we opened up, they shot up again. The thing of it is, and I would just want to ask you this question, how realistic is this? How realistic is this, that we're going to go into some type of, people stop driving their cars, people stop taking flights. What will that do to the world economy? And I know we're facing an existential threat, but I can't help but ask that, Peter.
Well, there's all kinds of world economies. We're on a world economy which is destroying our future and destroying the planet and all life on the planet, including the oceans and all life in the oceans right now. We don't want to stay on that economy. There's another economy, which is the clean, renewable energy economy. All we have to do is switch. All we have to do is convert. all we have to do is stop making bad money and make more and more and more good money. Really, the market economy can do this. All that's happening is that all of these world powers are stopping it happening.
Yes, we have the solution. Do we have the people to enact it, especially our politicians who are bought and sold by the fossil fuel industry? That's the part that's really hard to come to terms with. Paul, I know you've done a lot of looking into this aspect of mitigation, and I'm wondering what you have to share with us.
Yes, thank you, Regina and Peter. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Working Group 3 report is all on mitigation. Working Group 2 is on adaptation and resilience, and that was released several months ago. And then prior to that, a few months before, was Working Group 1, the physical science basis. This is all part of Assessment Report 6, the Assessment Report 6 process. The previous assessment report was about I guess 7 or 8, 9 years ago, something like that. Combined, the page count of these 3 reports is 10,500 pages. Working Group 3 is 3,000. So I don't know about you guys, but it just came out 3 days ago, and I haven't read it yet, the 3,000 pages. So I'm going mostly off of the summary. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights. And also, because of the delay in the process, the data covered is up to the end of 2019. It takes maybe 6 months to a year for the scientists to analyze that data and prepare a paper. Then they submit it to a journal, and that might take 6 months to go through the peer review process. And then it's published by the journal. And it still takes a year, maybe year up to 2 years for the IPCC to incorporate it in their report. So that's why the data only is to the end of 2019, which is interesting. So global net anthropogenic emissions are still rising. So this is CO2 equivalent, which includes methane, fluorinated compounds, CO2, N2O. In 2019, it was 59 gigatons, which is a huge number. Now, current greenhouse gas emissions plus historical greenhouse gas emissions, they're not at all evenly distributed around the planet, as we know. The top 10% of households produce 34 to 45% of the emissions, the bottom half only 13 to 15% emissions. And we're talking about, the least developed countries, the LDCs, less than 0.4% of historical CO2. And the island states, less than 0.5% of all historical CO2. And those are the regions that are suffering the most. Now, it is possible for countries to cut emissions over a sustained period for longer than a decade. So 18 countries have done so on a production and the consumption emission basis. So all their emissions of what they produce and what they consume, and they've cut it over the last 10 years consistently. So it is possible for the rest of the, that 18 countries out of a global, close to 200 countries, so that it can be done. Now, there has been dramatic decline in the cost of key technologies since the AR5. So in the last decade, solar costs down 85%. That's photovoltaic solar. Wind power, both onshore and offshore, down about 55%. The cost, this is the cost per kilowatt hour of power. Battery technology greatly improved, power densities greatly improved, and cost down 85%. And also all of these things are also being deployed more and more quickly. It's still a small chunk compared to fossil fuels. Now, this report is on mitigation. The last one, Working Group 2, on adaptation. Now, I see mitigation is more of a global thing. We keep global average temperature below 2. Below 1.5, they still talk about in this report, but personally, I think, that boat has sailed. The adaptation is more on the local scale, a smaller scale, both in time and space, like a city putting in a seawall, building codes being changed. So larger diameter sewers and things. So adaptation is mostly, a regional or a city-based objective, whereas mitigation is addressing the overall problem. So I'll talk about a couple other things. Okay, so climate policies are doing something. They're all working, but they're not working fast enough, and they're not covering all emissions. So only 53% of global greenhouse gases are covered by direct laws or policy. So there's a lot of loopholes and gaps. And for example, air travel, commercial air travel, passenger air travel, militaries are another one. Like, think of all the emissions that resulted from building the war material that Russia has sent into the Ukraine. Think of all the buildings and things destroyed there, and how rebuilding those sort of things, has a huge carbon penalty. Current climate policies and pledges, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions out to 2030, are just insufficient to keep us below 1.5. Like I said, that boat sailed. Likely below 2 is extremely difficult to do. And they use a baseline of 1850 to 1900 in this report, not the 1750 one. I've talked about baseline shift. If you look at the fossil fuel infrastructure that exists, if it is just tapered off, with the natural lifetime of power plants, we're going to way overshoot the budget. We have to close these things down and certainly not build any new ones.
What I want to ask you, because you shot through some really important key points. 1.5 is kind of pipe dream at this point. As you say, that ship has sailed. Below 2 is perhaps not realistic. And I think part of the problem that I get is when people hear this, they're like, well, I'm not, when is that? It's just, I want to know, when are you saying that this is going to be? Is it going to be?
We'll probably shoot past 1.5, certainly within the next decade. Probably the next powerful El Nino event may take us there already. So it could be, less than 5 years. What the report does to deal with this is they've come up with a whole new category, a whole new way of categorizing mitigation scenarios. So they use the term from C1, C2 up to C8. C1 is basically 1.5 Celsius with no or limited offshoot. And then some of the scenarios, C2, C3, et cetera, they allow to go past 1.5, but there's scenarios where they think the measures that we can do will not have us over 1.5 for long, but we'll back it off or lower it off fairly quickly. So they also talk about the need for large-scale CO2 removal, which we don't have at any scale at the moment, but they do talk about it. And this is why they use the term net zero, because it's not just emissions, but it's emissions minus what we can remove. So in any event, we need substantial reduction of overall fossil fuel use. And, they don't go far enough. Of course, it might be in the details, but they don't go far enough on removing fossil fuel subsidies. They do talk a bit about demand side mitigation. So lowering demand by shifting diets, transport patterns, et cetera, cutting end use emissions 40 to 70% by 2050. So they're hitting that end now. And the reason why they've never done, this is the first time they're doing that, first report that they're doing that. And the reason is because you need that in order to have any chance of keeping even below 2 degrees Celsius. And they do a good comparison of how each of the mitigation techniques fare in relative to this 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They say a price of carbon of US $100 a ton could actually have the 2019 levels by 2030. So there's lots in the report, tons of stuff in the report.
I'm hoping that we can put a link to it in the description so that people will be able to look that up. I think that'll be something that you'll really want to do after this. I'm just wondering, Peter, I know that you've been very passionate in your call for the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies. I feel the exact same way. To me, it's crazy that we're giving money to this huge industry that makes a tremendous amount of money and that is really causing a net harm. In terms of transportation, how realistic is it? And one of the things that I often wondered, so let's say that we have these Teslas, these wonderful cars, the energy that we call clean energy, isn't a lot of that energy derived from the burning of fossil fuels? I'm just wondering about that.
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. Electric cars are doing basically nothing now because the internal combustion engine vehicles are still being made, and they're still massively outselling in new cars, massively outselling electric cars. But electrification is essential, but the electricity all has to be provided by clean, renewable energy. And it all can be provided by clean, renewable energy. We've actually known that for many, many, many years. Many studies have been done to prove that. The other thing that I should mention that I was happy that the media picked up on was that our emissions have to be cut 50% by 2030. So that's our goal. And we can do it. Absolutely no question, we can do it. But we got to fight our governments, and we got to fight our banks, and we've got to stop all the obstruction. I mean, it's more than a crime what is going on. And I feel very, very bad for the young people because they don't see anything happening very much, and they're exactly right. They don't really see that there are any plans that are being done on their behalf. So the gold standard for me is, what is life going to be like for 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds in 20, 30, 40 years? I think that's what we've got to decide. As a society, unfortunately, and I'm not saying it's our fault, because our society is faulty because its economics is faulty. But right now we've decided that they're not going to have a future. They're not going to have a future worth living. That's what's been decided. So the question is, do we want to change that? Or, do we want to just keep on rolling along as things are? The Working Group 3 started off making the point that emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions in the past 10 years, they've never increased as rapidly as much. If you look at those graphs that they provided, global emissions took off from year 2000. And they've been going on a straight line virtually up ever since. It hasn't faltered. We had the COVID drop, but now, when this is absolutely awful because of our governments and fossil fuel corporations, we're now back to record global emissions. 2021 was a record global emissions. That means that we're staying on the same trend that does not give those children, those young people, a future. And my view is we just got to fight for that. Everybody has to fight for it. It may not look feasible, but it has to be possible, and it is possible. I just point out one thing. The carbon capture, storage, the removal of CO2. When are we going to do it? This report says we're not going to start to do it until 2050. Why the hell wouldn't we be starting to do it now?
Peter, is the reason they say that we're not going to start doing it until 2050, is it because I've heard about the incredible cost? Is it because the technology is not there, because it costs too much? Why the delay?
$200 a ton. Look at all the money we're spending on armaments, right? It's peanuts. Well, we're sending another $1.5 billion just over to one country who needs it right now. The $800 billion for the United States. We just got to stop pouring money down the drain and pour money into our future.
Yeah, it's an issue of priorities, to say the least. So tell us a bit more about mitigation, Paul.
Yes. So we have to remember to think of a cost benefit sort of analysis. I mean, the report talks about having a very minimal hit to GDP to like a small GDP penalty, relatively small, by having say $100 or $200 a ton cost on carbon. Many governments claim that they're lacking resources and money, and then we get hit by a pandemic, and they have all kinds of money that they put into programs, and unfortunately they put in record amounts of money in supporting fossil fuel companies with the subsidies, and that goes for banks as well. Even just about a week ago or less, Canadian federal government came out with their emissions reduction plan, where they go sector by sector and look, how can we best reduce emissions, on a sector by sector basis, which is good. It's a more detailed way of looking at it. And I see why they did it, because it mirrors what is in the Working Group 3 mitigation report. They do the same thing. So they say that the economic benefits, of limiting warming to 2 degrees C outweighs the cost. There's huge societal disruption. And there's many other cascading effects or domino effects, and we can see that sort of thing happening. I thought that the likelihood of a global food shortage within 5 to 10 years was very high, directly from abrupt climate change, hitting crop growing regions with extreme weather events, whether they be torrential rains leading to massive floods or heat waves leading to drought, withering crops. Then Russia invades the Ukraine, and Ukraine produces 14% of the world's grain crops, and they won't be exporting this year. They need the food for their own people, plus their production will go way down. And Russia's 17% of the grain crops, and they say they won't export to countries that don't support them. So it looks like events like this come along, and actually, I thought I was having a very sort of plausible time frame, 5 to 10 years, and it could be happening later on in the summer. There could be food stresses in places like Africa, because countries have different levels of resilience to something like food prices. If you're spending half of your income on food and it doubles, you basically have no money for anything else but food. The penalties from these sort of things are totally disproportionate. So we're in a world of consequences, and I think the language in the IPCC reports is becoming much more reflective of this, much more dire. And but again, we're in a situation where, the last report that came out was completely overshadowed by Russia invading Ukraine, and this report, it'll be news this week but then it will drop off the headlines and just be another huge, massive report that most people don't read. But, we can't just throw up our hands. We have to figure out what to do and keep trying. And I'd love to see military budgets, that sort of scale of money going into these issues of mitigation, and adaptation, just following the science, and using the knowledge and know-how of tens and tens and tens of thousands of scientists and engineers who right now build a lot of machinery for the military industrial complex around the world. Let's just say, okay, we got enough stuff right now. Now countries are talking about upping their military and so on, to face their realization that Russia is a threat to world peace. But we have to keep our eye on the climate change ball, because that is going to dwarf anything that is happening, unless there's a full out nuclear exchange or something. Ironically, we can worry about all of these things, and then there's some comet or asteroid coming directly from the sun at us. It's a couple miles in size, and we only see it like a week before it hits us. And then all our worries are for naught, right? So, but we're humans, so we try to survive. We're quite a resilient species, and we can do all of the wrong things until our backs are to the wall, and then hopefully enough people wake up, and we can actually get to work on protecting and saving and ensuring our planet remains habitable, not just to humans, but to all life, plants and animals.
I often, especially recently, I wonder, what could we possibly do to get people to be as enthralled and enraptured and concerned about climate change as they are about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, or as they call it, the slap heard around the world. how many Harveys, how many Sandys, how many of these storms will it take? Or the people just seem so inured. Let's just hope that this most recent report has somewhat of an effect of Will Smith. I don't know, one can only hope, but we have to keep hope alive. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to link the report in the description. Please do check it out. Don't be overwhelmed. I mean, I myself found it quite overwhelming. You know, even if you skim through and just pick the parts and that you find that you can understand, and let yourself take some time to absorb it. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Climate Emergency Forum.